Hello and a very warm welcome to everybody joining me for today's installment of Inside SA Media, which is of course proudly brought to you by Tribox Media and Fact Fort. My name is Lung Sankyo on a chair. Let's get into it. Every news story is told through a lens. The question is, whose lens is it? In South Africa, a country with a turbulent history but a vibrant democracy, media bias is a reality that doesn't just shape the headlines, but also shapes the way we understand our world. Every day, millions of South Africans tune in, scroll, and read the news to make sense of the world around them. But what if the way the news is selected, told, and framed is quietly shaping how we think, without us even realizing it? So today we're unpacking something that affects every single news story that we consume: media bias. What is it, how it shows up in South Africa, and why it matters more than ever? Most of the time, bias is subtle. It's in the choice of words, it's in the choice of what image is used, or even what stories get published, and even the ones that don't get published. So we're going to break it down into four key types: selection bias, framing bias, partisan bias, and ownership bias. And then we'll bring it home with examples from South Africa's media history. Alright, so number one, selection bias. Now, selection bias is all about what gets covered and what gets ignored. Think of it like the editorial equivalent of looking through a window. You see what's in the frame, but not what's outside of that frame. In South Africa, we've seen this play out in how maybe rural communities are often underreported on. A drought that devastates a farming village might barely get like a mention, while a water outage in a big city leads to the evening bulletin. Or consider how some protest movements get wall-to-wall coverage, while others, particularly in smaller towns, are barely acknowledged. So the selection of stories sends a message about what's important and what's not. Number two, framing bias. Now, framing bias is about how a story is told. Facts may be correct, but the way they're presented can actually have an impact or change the meaning. So take service delivery protests, for example. One outlet might lead with images of burning tires and headlines about violence and unrest, so framing the protesters as dangerous. Another might open with interviews about years of ignored grievances, framing the same people as citizens demanding justice. So same protest, same facts, but two very different public perceptions. Number three, partisan bias. Partisan bias is when the media leans towards or against a particular political party or ideology. It doesn't always mean outright propaganda. Sometimes it's in who gets interviewed, or how their quotes are used, or what scandals are actually pursued. In South Africa, you can think about the different coverage of corruption scandals depending on whether they involve the ANC, the DA, or the EFF. The tone, the depth of investigation, and even the choice of language can reveal, the subtle allegiances. So readers may walk away with a skewed impression, not necessarily because of false reporting, but because of how the reporting is angled. And finally, let's look at ownership bias. So this is the influence, which is sometimes visible or invisible, of who owns the platform that you're consuming. Owners have business interests, political connections, or ideological leanings that can trickle down into editorial choices. Historically, South Africa's apartheid era press showed stark examples of ownership bias, with pro-government papers ignoring or downplaying anti-apartheid movements. So even today, some argue that coverage of mining strikes, for instance, can be softened in outlets that are linked to corporate stakeholders. Ownership doesn't mean every journalist is biased, but it does mean the playing field isn't perfectly level. When media bias goes unchecked, It shapes public opinion in ways that aren't always transparent. So we will form opinions, vote, and make decisions based on information that we assume is neutral, but may already be tilted. The good news is that once you know the signs, you can spot them. Look for what's missing in the story. Compare the coverage from different outlets. Ask whose voice is being amplified or whose voice is missing in the story. The more aware we are, the less likely we are to be, quietly steered into one direction or the other. So to understand media bias in South Africa today, we need to step back into a time where bias wasn't so subtle. It was literally baked into the system. So during apartheid, most mainstream media served the interests of white minority rule. This wasn't just editorial slant, it was deliberate and it was state-driven. So take the Citizen scandal, for example, the paper that was secretly funded through a government propaganda slush fund to push all this pro-apartheid narratives and stories, all while presenting itself as an independent voice. Then there was also the state broadcaster, the SABC at the time, which functioned less as a source of balanced reporting and more so as an official mouthpiece for the regime of the time. And it was amplifying a lot of the government messaging while it silenced a lot of dissent. On the other side stood the alternative press, papers like the Weekly Mail and Vrye Weekblad. They were all fighting to tell the stories the government wanted buried. They faced relentless censorship, bans, and harassment. We know that story. So the key truth here is that bias wasn't just a matter of opinion or editorial judgment. It was systemic, it was legally enforced, and it was weaponized. So what the public perceived as news was often just propaganda dressed in the language of what journalism usually sounds like or should sound like. So with the end of apartheid, South Africa's media landscape kind of opened up, and for the first time there was true diversity in the voices that came out, that were emerging at the time. Independent investigative units like the Mail and Guardian and Amapungane took root, digging deep into corruption and holding power to account. This was a new era, it was freer, it was bolder, and it was definitely more representative. But freedom didn't erase bias, it simply reshaped it. So political and corporate influence began to seep into newsrooms in different ways. The SABC, once again in the spotlight, faced accusations of favoring ruling party narratives. Most infamously, of course, in 2016, when the then COO, Hlaudi Motsoeneng, banned coverage of certain protests. In the commercial sphere, dependence on advertising revenue created a subtler pressure, the quiet softening of stories that might upset major advertisers. The dynamics had changed, but the underlying challenge remained, which is that when powerful interests set the agenda, the truth can still be the first casualty. In recent years, ownership patterns have brought a new layer to the conversation when we talk about media bias in South Africa. Take the Sekunjalo Independent Media Group, for instance, right? We've covered the Sekunjalo Independent Media Group quite extensively in a previous episode, so you can go and have a look at everything that is in there. So if we look at this group, so critics have obviously accused it of editorial interference with coverage that often leans towards pro-Sekunjalo framing. Reports on public protector investigations and on detractors of the group's chairperson, Iqbal's survey, have at times been presented less as straightforward scrutiny and more so as part of a broader conspiracy against him. On the other side of the media landscape, TSO Blackstar, now known as Arena Holdings, has faced its own critiques, right? While it has produced strong investigative work, some argue its editorial tone reflects the perspective of an elite or urban middle class, perspectives that can overlook the daily realities of South Africa's working class majority. The deeper issue is this: when owners hold powerful business or political interests, those interests can subtly or overtly shape the newsroom priorities. And in a country where inequality runs deep, whose voice gets amplified and whose voice gets ignored remains a question that is worth asking. Media bias in South Africa isn't always about what gets reported. Sometimes it's about how stories are told and whose side the audience believes a journalist is on. The Daily Maverick has won praise for its fearless investigative work, unearthing corruption and holding power to account, but not everyone sees its reporting as neutral. So some have accused it of being openly hostile towards certain factions within the ANC, an editorial stance they believe colors the framing of key political stories. Meanwhile, independent media faces the opposite set of accusations, that its coverage often aligns with the political allies of its owner. So critics point to story selection, tone, and even omission as signs that the newsroom's compass points towards protecting particular interests. In the digital era, these perceptions don't stay in the newsroom. We have social media now that amplifies them, and with journalists themselves becoming targets of personal attacks or even celebrated maybe as heroes, all based on perceived political allegiances. And once that perception of bias takes hold, it can be just as influential as the reporting itself. Public trust in the media is a fragile thing, and in South Africa, it's been fluctuating noticeably over recent years. According to the Alderman Trust Barometer, many South Africans are growing increasingly skeptical about whether journalists can remain impartial or if hidden agendas influence their reporting. This perception of bias doesn't just affect how people view the news, it shapes their media choices. Feeling let down or misled by mainstream outlets, some will turn to alternative sources that often lack credibility or rigorous fact-checking. This shift can then deepen the spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories, which makes it harder for citizens to discern fact from fiction. For a healthy democracy, we need journalism that is not only robust but also fearless and transparent about its own limitations and biases. Only then can the public engage critically with the news, trusting that they are getting the full picture, not a distorted view. In a complex media landscape, audiences have a vital role to play. To navigate bias and build a clearer picture of the truth, it's important to read widely, to consume multiple sources, to compare perspectives. You have to be mindful of who owns the outlets that you follow, as ownership shapes what gets reported and how. And remember to distinguish between straight news, opinion pieces, and in-depth analysis. Each of these serves a different purpose. At the same time, journalists and editors carry a heavy responsibility. Transparency is key. Disclosing any conflicts of interest helps to build trust. Newsrooms must strive to diversify voices, reflecting the full spectrum of South African society rather than just the privileged few. And when criticism comes, whether from colleagues or the public, engaging with it openly and constructively strengthens journalism's integrity and relevance. Bias in the media isn't always a malicious plot. Sometimes it's unconscious, sometimes it's systemic. But it matters because the way we see the world is shaped by the stories that we're told. And in a democracy, recognizing bias is the first step towards demanding better and building a media landscape that reflects the full truth of South Africa. Media bias is also not about vilifying journalists. It's about understanding the invisible forces that shape our news. Next time you open a paper or switch on the TV or scroll through your different social media feeds, remember, you're not just consuming the news, you're also seeing the choices that shaped the news that you're consuming. Thank you so very much for joining me for today's installment of Inside SA Media. Please do join me next time as we continue to peel back more of the layers of how South Africa's media really works. From myself, Lungswenya Onachia, it is goodbye.